When I first bought my house, I thought I had found my personal oasis. Secluded, spacious, and most importantly, private. Nestled just outside a cookie-cutter HOA neighborhood, my land felt like a perfect retreat from the overly managed, rule-heavy living situations I'd heard horror stories about. The best part? My property was entirely independent of the HOA's jurisdiction. No monthly fees, no ridiculous regulations about grass height or mailbox colors, and no self-important board members breathing down my neck. It was just me, my land, and peace. At least that's what I thought. The trouble began about a month after I moved in. I had been walking the perimeter of my property when I noticed something strange. Tire tracks in the dirt. They weren't mine, and they weren't just from one vehicle. There were multiple sets, deep grooves running straight through my land toward the HOA neighborhood's main street. At first, I assumed it was just a fluke. Maybe a lost delivery driver had cut through by accident. But over the next few days, the pattern became impossible to ignore. More cars, more tire tracks, more dust kicked up as vehicles boldly drove across my land like it was some kind of public road. At first, I was just baffled. Was this some old access road I hadn't been informed about? Maybe a forgotten easement? I pulled up the deed, checked the property lines, and confirmed what I already knew. This was my land. There was no public right-of-way, no easement, and no reason why a bunch of strangers should be treating my private property like a highway. Curious, I started watching. I set up a lawn chair near the edge of my property and just observed for an entire afternoon. What I saw infuriated me. Car after car used my land as a shortcut. They weren't just lost or confused, they were deliberately cutting through, using my property to shave a few minutes off their drive to the main road. Some of them barely slowed down, their tires kicking up gravel and dust like they owned the place. A few even waved at me as if I was the guest here. That night, I went online and started researching property rights, trespassing laws, and HOA overreach. I came across dozens of horror stories. Homeowners bullied into submission by entitled HOA boards, land disputes that dragged on for years, and legal loopholes that people had to fight tooth and nail to close. But one thing was clear. I was completely within my rights to block access to my land. The HOA had zero claim over it, no matter how long people had been using it. Armed with this knowledge, I decided to talk to my new neighbors. I figured maybe this was just a misunderstanding, and a polite conversation would fix things. I was wrong. I approached the first couple I saw walking their dog near my property's edge. "Hey there. I'm new to the area and just wanted to introduce myself." They smiled politely, exchanging names, and for a moment, I thought things were going well. Then I asked, "I've noticed a lot of cars cutting through my land. Do you know anything about that?" Their expressions immediately changed. "Oh," the woman said, looking suddenly uncomfortable. That's just something we've always done." The previous owner didn't mind. I raised an eyebrow. "Well, I mind." Her husband cleared his throat. "It's really convenient for everyone. The main road gets backed up and this is just easier." I frowned. "Yeah, but it's my land. And I'm not comfortable with people using it." The wife gave me an awkward smile. "I'm sure the HOA can explain it better. You should talk to Karen." I didn't know who Karen was at the time, but I was about to find out. The next afternoon, while mowing my lawn, I saw a woman marching toward me with the kind of confidence that only comes from a lifetime of entitlement. She was dressed in an immaculate white blouse, beige slacks, and an expression of pure disdain. "You must be the new owner," she said, not bothering with a greeting. I turned off the mower and wiped my hands on my jeans. "Yeah, that's me. And you are?" "Karen," she said, as if that name should explain everything. "I'm on the HOA board." I almost laughed. "Oh, well, nice to meet you, Karen. What can I do for you?" She gave a tight smile. "I heard you're upset about the road." I narrowed my eyes. "You mean my land?" Her smile twitched. "The access point," she corrected. "Listen, I understand you're new here, but that road has been in use for years. The previous owner never had a problem with it. It's an important shortcut for the community, and I think it would be best if we just left things the way they are." I folded my arms. "Karen, with all due respect, it's not a road. It's private property. and I don't want people using it anymore. She scoffed, as if I had just told her the sky was green. You can't just cut off an entire neighborhood like that. That's completely unreasonable. No, what's unreasonable is a bunch of people trespassing on land that isn't theirs, I shot back. Her face twisted into an exaggerated frown. Do you have any idea how inconvenient this is going to be for people? I shrugged. Not my problem. Karen lost it. She threw her hands in the air. This is ridiculous. I'm on the HOA board, and I can promise you, we won't stand for this. I smirked. Well, lucky for me, I'm not in the HOA, so you don't have any authority over me. Her face turned beet red. She pulled out her phone, took a deep breath, and said something that made me laugh out loud. I'm calling the police. I shook my head. Go ahead. And that's when I knew this was only the beginning. Karen stared at me like I had just committed a crime against humanity. Her face, already red with frustration, darkened further as she clenched her phone in her hand. Her lips curled in fury, and her chest rose and fell in quick, angry breaths. I had seen entitlement before, but this was a whole new level. She was truly outraged that I had the audacity to claim my own property and enforce boundaries. I stood there, arms crossed, watching the gears turn in her head. She was so used to getting her way that she couldn't fathom someone standing up to her. The silence between us stretched for a few agonizing seconds before she let out a huff and dialed 911. Hello? Yes. I'd like to report a crime. Her voice trembled with righteous indignation as she turned her back to me, as if that would make me disappear. There's a man blocking a public access road. He's refusing to let me through. I let out a laugh, shaking my head. She wasn't just entitled, she was delusional. The moment she said the words, public access road, I knew this was going to be a disaster. She was straight up lying to the police. There was no public road here, just a strip of my private land that had been used illegally for years. Karen turned to glare at me as she continued talking. Yes, it's an emergency. He put up a gate and is harassing residents of our community. She cast me a triumphant look, as if I was supposed to be scared. I need officers here immediately. I stayed silent. There was no point arguing with someone this deep in their own fantasy world. The truth would come out soon enough. When she hung up, she crossed her arms and smirked. Now, let's see how funny you think this is when the police arrive. I shrugged. I'm looking forward to it. She scoffed, but I could see a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. She expected me to panic, to back down, to cave to her authority. But I didn't, and that made her nervous. We stood there in silence for nearly 15 minutes until I heard the sound of an approaching police car. The blue and red lights flickered through the trees before the vehicle pulled up beside the gate. 2 officers stepped out, one older and serious-looking, the other younger, probably still new to the job. Karen immediately launched into her dramatics. Officers, thank God you're here. This man, she pointed at me with the intensity of a prosecutor at a murder trial, illegally put up a gate and is blocking a public access road. He's preventing us from reaching our homes. The older officer, a tall man with sharp eyes, looked at me and then at the locked gate. His expression didn't change. Is this true? He asked, his tone neutral. No, I said simply. Karen's head whipped toward me. Liar, she shrieked. I ignored her and addressed the officers directly. This is my property. It's never been a public access road. It's private land that people have been trespassing on for years, and I put up this gate to stop it. The officer studied me for a second, then turned to Karen. Ma'am, do you have any proof that this is a public road? Karen blinked. It was clear that she hadn't expected to be questioned. I don't need proof. It's common knowledge that this has been used as an access point for years. Everyone knows that. The younger officer pulled out a notepad. Do you have any legal documents? A town zoning map? Anything that shows this road belongs to the HOA or is designated for public use? Karen's face went pale for just a second before she recovered. No, but... Great, I interrupted. I had been ready for this. I reached into my back pocket and pulled out my property deed and a printed map from the township office. showing the official boundary lines. Here's the legal proof that I own this land. And if that's not enough, I've got security footage of people trespassing, as well as records showing that there's no easement or public claim on this property. The older officer took the papers and looked them over, nodding slowly. This checks out. He handed them to his partner, who gave them a quick glance before writing something down. Karen's confidence cracked. Wait, that can't be right, she stammered. We've been using this road for years. That has to mean something. The older officer turned back to her. Ma'am, just because people have been trespassing for years doesn't mean it's legal. This is private property. He has every right to block access. Karen's mouth fell open. She actually looked like she might faint. But the younger officer sighed. If you and other residents have been using this land without permission, you are actually the ones in the wrong. If the owner wanted to, he could press trespassing charges. I smiled at Karen. You hear that? You should be grateful I'm not calling the cops on you. Her expression contorted with rage. This isn't over, she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. I will take this to the HOA. You don't know who you're messing with. The older officer held up a hand. That's fine, ma'am. But as far as the law is concerned, you need to respect this property. If you or anyone else from your community tries to go through here again, you will be trespassing, and that's a criminal offense. Karen's nostrils flared. She opened her mouth to argue but clamped it shut when she saw the officer's dead serious expression. Finally, after a tense pause, she whirled around and stomped back to her car. She yanked open the door, got in, and peeled away, tires screeching in the gravel. The younger officer shook his head. That was something, I chuckled. You have no idea. The older officer handed me back my documents. You're in the right here. If she or anyone else gives you trouble, call us. I nodded. Appreciate it. They left a few minutes later, and I stood there, watching the dust settle from Karen's hasty retreat. I had won this round, but I knew it wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat. I could already imagine her storming into the next HOA meeting, ranting about me, demanding they do something, and I was right, because a few days later, I received an official letter from the HOA, demanding that I remove my gate. Karen had escalated the fight, and now, it was war. A few days after Karen's humiliating defeat with the police, I received an official-looking envelope in the mail, stamped with the HOA's logo. I almost laughed when I saw it. She actually did it. She actually ran to the HOA board like a child tattling to a teacher, desperate to get her way. I opened the letter and scanned its contents. My amusement quickly turned into annoyance. You are hereby requested to attend an HOA board meeting to discuss the unauthorized obstruction of a historically used access road. Failure to comply with community regulations may result in further action. I shook my head, in disbelief but not in surprise. The sheer audacity of it all was staggering. I wasn't in their HOA. I had never signed any agreement that bound me to their rules. And yet, here they were, trying to flex authority over land they had no legal claim to. At first, I considered ignoring the letter entirely. Let them talk about me in their little meeting. What could they possibly do? But then I thought about Karen. I thought about how relentless she was. If I ignored this, she'd twist the story to make it seem like I was in the wrong. I needed to shut this down completely, so I decided to go to the meeting. If they wanted a fight, I was bringing the biggest sword to the battlefield. I arrived at the HOA office a few minutes early, a folder tucked under my arm with every legal document I could possibly need. Karen was already there, seated at the head of the long table like a queen on her throne. She shot me a smug look as I walked in, like she had already won. The room was full of board members, middle-aged men in suits, older women who looked like they enjoyed arguing over shrub height, and a few neutral-looking members who probably didn't even care. The board president, a balding man with glasses perched on the tip of his nose, cleared his throat. "Let's get started," he said, looking at me with a forced, polite smile. "We're here today to discuss a community concern regarding the obstruction of an important access road." I held up a hand before he could go any further. "Before we begin, let's get one thing straight. This isn't a community concern. This is private property. I pulled out the property deed and placed it on the table. I own that land. It is not an access road. It never was. Karen made a noise somewhere between a scoff and a laugh. Oh, please, she said, rolling her eyes. We all know that just because you own something doesn't mean you can be inconsiderate to the community. I raised an eyebrow. You mean inconsiderate like trespassing on private property? Like damaging my land? Like ignoring my legal rights because it's inconvenient for you? She scowled, but the board president held up a hand. Let's keep things civil. He looked at my documents, adjusting his glasses. His neutral expression shifted slightly, and I could tell he hadn't expected me to come so prepared. This is very clear, he admitted. But the concern remains that this road has been used for years. That does set a precedent. I expected this argument. A precedent? I leaned forward. So if I walked through someone's backyard every day for years without permission, does that make it my backyard? Silence. A few board members shifted uncomfortably. I continued, you don't get ownership of something just because you've been using it illegally for a long time. That's not how property law works. Karen's face turned red. This is ridiculous. You're making things more difficult for everyone. I shrugged. No, Karen. You are making things difficult for yourself. The police already confirmed that I have the right to block off my property. So why are we even here? One of the other board members, an older woman with a deep frown line etched into her forehead, cleared her throat. Because the community is affected. It may be your land, but your actions impact others. I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. So let me get this straight. You all ignored this when I had cars tearing up my land. You ignored it when I had strangers trespassing. You ignored it when I asked nicely for people to stop using my property. But now that I've done something to protect what's legally mine, you suddenly care about impact? Dead silence. Karen's lips were pressed into a thin line, her hands gripping the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. Finally, the board president sighed. Legally speaking, there's nothing we can do. Karen's head snapped toward him so fast I thought her neck might break. What? You're just going to let him get away with this? The president rubbed his temples, clearly tired of this nonsense. Karen, we can't enforce rules on land we don't own. The words hit her like a freight train. She opened her mouth, then closed it, then opened it again, but nothing came out. I smiled. Checkmate. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. A week later, I got a call from my lawyer. You're not going to believe this, he said, barely holding back laughter. Karen is trying to sue you. I pinched the bridge of my nose. For what? She's claiming that the HOA had an implied easement over your property because of historical use. I almost burst out laughing. Implied easement? That was the most ridiculous thing I'd ever heard. An easement had to be legally documented and recognized. You couldn't just claim one because it was convenient. I assume we're not taking this seriously? I asked. Oh, absolutely not. It won't hold up in court. But if you want, we could countersue for legal fees. That gave me an idea. Instead of waiting for this nonsense to drag out in court, I sent the story to a local news station. HOA board member tries to steal private land made for a hell of a headline. And it worked. Within days, Karen became the most hated person in the neighborhood. People who had once used the shortcut turned against her for making them look bad. Some residents even apologized to me, saying they had no idea she was this unhinged. Then came the final nail in the coffin. The HOA released an official statement saying Karen had been removed from the board due to unnecessary legal action and failure to represent the community's best interests. Karen, gone. My land, safe. And the best part? Not a single car has driven across my property since. Looking back, this whole ordeal taught me a valuable lesson. Some people believe that just because something has always been a certain way, that means they are entitled to it. But reality doesn't work that way. I wasn't just fighting for my land. I was standing up to the kind of entitlement that lets people think they can rewrite the rules when it benefits them. And in the end, I won.